there's all these protests going on in like France and Indonesia and Nepal. And it's like, well, why can't we have that in America? We've had it before. Civil rights was massive protests, and it led to the Civil Rights Act, one of the most monumental pieces of legislation in American history. A good one, just in case we were unclear about that based on Charlie Kirk. The civil rights protests didn't have as many people. It was like in the hundreds of thousands, up to 500,000 a day in one of the biggest days in civil rights, whereas Black Lives Matter had tens of millions of people participated throughout. Now, it did last over many years, but I think the Black Lives Matter protests and our policymakers' response is part of the reason that we're struggling today. Republicans in red states systematically neutered the effectiveness of protests while cracking down on the thing that the people were protesting for. The Black Lives Matter protest started in around 2013 and culminated in 2020. Around 2017, states and local governments, not federal, but state and local governments started passing legislation in response to these protests. And the response by Republican policymakers was markedly different than that of Democrats. Blue states tended to respond to the concerns of the protesters, which were that Black people were being disproportionately murdered by police officers and still are, and responded by protecting protesters. Whereas red states did the opposite. Blue states tended to pass legislation that required body cams, that banned no-knock warrants, that enforced, as part of your police training, racial bias training. And on the front of the protesters, they passed legislation that banned the use of excessive fees, and they increased legal protections for protesters. Whereas red states tended to increase legal protections for police officers and decrease legal support for civilians to bring cases forward about police overreach. And they passed things like Back the Blue legislation, which again made police even more powerful. And red states passed legislation that used more vague definitions of the word riot as opposed to protest, so that more protests were deemed riots and the police could step in and had protections for using excessive force to squash it. Some red states even passed legislation to provide you legal impunity if you as a civilian or drive a car through a protest and injure and or kill protesters. They protected that person over the protesters. That doesn't sound like freedom of speech to me. Why 2017, you ask? Well, I'm not going to demonstrate a causal relationship, but it was the first full calendar year of Donald Trump's presidency. And now in 2025, the first full year of his second term, he's passing executive orders that can basically strip any rights away of anyone who dissents against him at all. One example being Jimmy Kimmel, but one example being any kind of protesters who criticize the government in any way. And it makes sense. Conservatives, by definition, are the ones preserving the status quo, where the status quo in America is it's okay to be bought by large corporations, billionaires, and PACs. Protests are the people's way of demanding that policymakers are responsible and accountable to us and not to their big corporate donors. And Republicans want to uphold that. And I'm not saying Democrats don't benefit from that. The more moderate, centrist Democrats don't do anything to address that. The more progressive ones tend to take less money from large corporate donors and PACs. And one of those PACs is PACs created by private prison companies. These PACs tend to mostly lobby Republican politicians. And so every year we pass higher and higher police budgets where in America we spend between $400 and $450 per person on police budgets, whereas those other three countries, France spends the next most at $80 to $100 per person, and Indonesia and Nepal spend $15 to $25 per person. So they spend more money on policing us and keep a police system that's focused on arrest and citation, but also when you get to prison, it's focused on punishment, both in terms of like mentally and physically, but also economically, so that you're more likely to come out in poverty, and then you're more likely to reoffend, ending up back in the prison system. This is yet again a way to funnel money from a typical American taxpayer, the money that goes into our police budgets, putting people into the for-profit prison system. The for-profit prison systems profit, and then they funnel that money back to Republican policymakers and towards the richest people in this country. Not to mention that in America, all of our necessities are behind a financial barrier. So if they target you economically by imposing fines on you or putting you into a for-profit prison system, you're less likely to be able to afford your necessities and therefore are more likely to die. It's all cyclical. The right loves to pose when the left protests as if it's like, well, they don't get what they want. They just burn shit down and they damage property or whatever. First of all, you're talking about inanimate objects when we're talking about living human beings. But also, like, this is just like the conversation around Charlie Kirk, like, oh, he got murdered for his opinions. It's like his opinions were that certain people don't deserve the same rights in this country. And this is the same thing with the Black Lives Matter protests, right? People were protesting because Black people were and still are disproportionately murdered by police officers. And the right chalks it up to, well, they just, when they don't get what they want, they burn shit down. It's like, dude, we're talking about people's lives here, and you're more worried about property and property damage. Whereas if a KKK member was protesting something, they'd be all in favor of rights for protesters. It's the lack of self-awareness for when someone's protesting for something you like versus when you don't. That's when you care about supporting people's freedom of speech and expression and protest.